bring this program to you today. We are really, really fortunate to have with us this evening Menachem Kaiser, who wrote Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. And let me tell you a few facts about Menachem. He is a writer currently living in Brooklyn. He grew up in Toronto, Canada, and has a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and an MFA from the University of Michigan, and was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, Bomb, Vogue, and other publications as well. And we're really pleased to have him here today. And his story and his book really addresses and talks to the issue of children and descendants of Holocaust survivors and pursuing their legacy and kind of trying to reclaim what was theirs in Europe. And I think that it's best if we let Menachem talk about this, but I will say it's a complicated story. It's kind of part travelogue, part history, and part commentary, really about his paternal grandfather, and who Menachem had never met, who had some property in Poland, and now Menachem's quest to find out about it and to try to reclaim it. So I thought, Menachem, we could begin by you talking a little bit about the central narrative of the book and how you came to take this journey and find yourself in Poland.
Sure. Let me just say it's so much fun to be here. Such a pleasure. Thank you to everyone who helped organize it and for everyone who's attending. I guess I could see most of you. I guess, like, if you've read the book, I guess raise your hand, which is totally okay if you haven't. That's great. So for those who haven't, let me give like a brief sort of intro into what it's about. The book is called Plunder. It's a memoir. And so the central narrative is my ongoing, very messy, error-prone attempt to reclaim property that belonged to my grandfather. How I came to it. It's a little bit of a long story. It is in the book. So in contrast to like a lot of, I would call, grandchildren of Holocaust survivor memoirs, I did not grow up with like a Holocaust narrative. So three of my four grandparents are Holocaust survivors. And it was like a big part of my Jewish identity, as in we sort of carried that around with us, but it wasn't like anything that we were all that curious about. We didn't, neither my siblings nor my cousins, we didn't really know any details about it. We didn't grow up with the sense of like, this was something to sort of explore. It was just something like a pretty static fact. And it was also, I forget that's like some certain like peers who I've met later on in life can't necessarily relate to this, but it was basically everyone I knew was a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. So it wasn't even seen as something unique. But in particular, so the story really revolves, as Norman said, around my grandfather. So his name was Mayor Menachem Kaiser. I'm named for him. My legal name is Mayor Menachem Kaiser. He died 8 years before I was born. So I obviously didn't know him, but even beyond that, I didn't know anything about him. He's just like his story was never really sketched, and I didn't know anything about his time in the camps, and I certainly didn't know anything about his pre-war life. And so I would say that had all been erased. Like we knew, I would call it like dark matter. Like we knew that his whole family had been murdered, but I couldn't tell you who those family members were. He had two siblings. I bet you from all the grandkids, no one would have been able to name the names of both siblings. All of which I'm saying is sort of like the ignorance was pretty complete. And so I grew up with this, again, was never really all that compelled to explore it. Could have easily gone my entire life without going to Poland. It wasn't something that was like seen as that important to go on a Roots trip or explore my legacy. But in 2010, I moved to Lithuania on a Fulbright where I started doing research in the Vilna ghetto. So nothing related to my family. I don't have family from Lithuania, but it was sort of like the first step into Eastern Europe and Holocaust history. And this part is actually not in the book. So here's a little bonus. While I was there, I ended up meeting this Hasidic guy in March in Vilnius. And you don't meet from Brooklyn, and like you don't meet American tourists in March in Vilnius, and you certainly don't meet Hasidic guys in March in Vilnius. And so he was a really interesting and compelling guy, and he turned out to be the road manager for the Scorpions, like the music group, like the German supergroup, who are in town on their Get Your Sting Out tour. And so here, this part's definitely not in the book. I actually hung out with the Scorpions. I actually took them to karaoke, where they refused to sing their own songs, even though I really begged. But it's a fun little anecdote. So I meet this guy. His name is Yak, and super compelling, interesting guy. Like honestly, a Hasidic guy who's a rock manager, and his dad is the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is like the historical region that no longer exists, but yet has a chief rabbi. It's funny that like the chief rabbinate of a region lasted longer than the actual region. And so, but his base was kind of in Krakow, and they were like, come to Krakow, you'll have a really good time, come for Rosh Hashanah. And so, you know, I went to Poland for the first time, nothing to do with my family, really, like, because I got invited there by a strange Hasidic guy. And I had kind of a really fun time. But while I was there, I was like, you know what, I'm in Krakow. I'm not far from where my grandfather was born. I should make this trip. And I really saw this trip as like an etiquette trip. It was like, if you're in town, you like visit those weird relatives you never talk to, but you just do it and get it over with. And so I called my dad. I was like, do you have an address? And he's like, I'll call you back. And he went through some old papers, and called me back, and he's like, yeah, Zadie grew up in this building on 12 Małachowskiego in Sosnovich. And so for me, you know, that was sort of like, it gave me like a shape to my mission. And so I put it on Google Maps, and I took 2 trains, and I went and I saw the building. I was like, wow, this is where my grandfather grew up. And I had like a sentimental moment. I snuck inside. I was like, oh, I wonder which apartment he grew up in. I took some photos, and I left. And like, at that point, if you would have asked me, I would have told you I would never have gone back. Like, I had no reason to go back. There wasn't anything I was chasing or exploring. I didn't have any questions. I just felt like I had fulfilled my obligation. But then over the next few years, I spent a lot of time in Poland. I was doing a lot of research in Eastern Europe, and I really sort of fell in love with Poland. And I spent a lot of time in Krakow, and it was kind of my base. And I met a lot of people who had reclaimed property or had attempted to reclaim property. And I would mention this to my dad periodically, and he'd say, you know, that building, we actually own it. And I was like, okay. And the more time I spent in Poland, the more my dad would needle me. He's like, look, you're there, check it out. Maybe there's something there. And I kept ignoring him. I kept being lazy. And finally in 2015, he just faxed me all the pages he had. It was just sort of a mess of documents. And it was a huge mess. It was like 4 different languages spread over 35 years, from all these different countries and different people. And there was translations and translations of translations and notarized copies. And so I spent all night going through those pages. And that was like a special moment for me, because like I felt at that moment was the first time in my life that I was, in a sense, meeting my grandfather. Because like I had never really given a lot of thought or like attempted to imagine who he was. And in these pages was his 30-year attempt to reclaim property and his 30-year failure to do so. And so like frustration is it's very sympathetic. And I really felt like, in a way, that I was, not to be too sentimental, but I really felt like I was meeting for him for the first time. And I was very interested in these questions of reclamation. And I was lucky enough to be in a position where I could, sort of pick up where he had left off. And so I asked another Hasidic guy for a lawyer recommendation, because who else are you going to get your lawyer recommendations from? And so they recommended me a lawyer in Krakow who went by and still goes by the Killer. That's how she's known in the book. She's a woman in her, I don't know, I actually don't know how old she is, somewhere between 80 and 120, let's say. And so that was my lawyer, and I brought all the pages, and I was like, let's try and reclaim this property. And that's pretty much the opening of the book. That everything I just said sort of comprises the first chapter. And I would say the core of the book, there's two threads, really. There's like this central thread of my attempts to reclaim property, and the hurdles and like the obstacles, and they operate on two levels. One is the legal one, obviously. And the main issue with the legal stuff was not actually the building. It was sort of petitioning the courts to recognize that my relatives who had died in the Holocaust were legally dead, because we didn't have death certificates for them because they basically disappeared. And so in like the Polish legal system, these people didn't have a death certificate, and they never inherited anything, and certainly never passed anything on. And so I had to petition the courts to recognize those deaths, and I kept failing. And so like that is like the main obstacle, and it's a little surreal or Kafkaesque or whatever you want to call it, of like coming before the judge and being like, yep, my great grandfather who was born in 1881 is dead, and the judge basically being like, but is he? Like, and so that was like one thing I had to figure it out. And like, maybe they were anti-Semitic, maybe not, maybe my lawyer made a mistake. Like it's just a huge mess, and like the errors started compounding. And the other one is, I would say, like the more moral issue of what it means to reclaim property when people are living there. And so I actually end up sort of, it's a bit of a long story, but I end up not being comfortable with doing this reclamation without meeting the residents. So I end up just knocking on the doors and being like, hi. And I started developing friendships and relationships with the people who live in the building, which proves to be really challenging because, here's a spoiler, I'm actually in the wrong building. I spent 2 years trying to reclaim the wrong one. Like, well, no, that's not entirely true. The legal efforts were still valid because like it was a paper, it was like, but I had been like in these relationships and these conversations with people in the wrong building. The addresses had shifted, and the real building was up the street. And so really that's like another example like of another error or mistake or even a typo. But those are, I would say, that's like the fuel for the narrative are the errors and the mistakes, which really allow you to start interrogating what it is you're doing. When everything goes smooth, you don't have to think about anything. It's like when everything starts going awry, you actually begin to question like what the mission is. The other, so that's like, I would say, one of the two main threads of the book, my attempts to reclaim the property. The other one is a lot stranger. And basically the short version is I found out that I had a relative I didn't know about who turned out to be my grandfather's closest surviving relative. So his first cousin. And we had been under the impression that none of his family survived. But the sort of really astonishing part is that he was, on account of a secret diary he had written in concentration camps while working as a slave laborer for secret Nazi underground complexes. That's a long sentence. On account of that secret diary, he had become a major celebrity / mythological figure among a subculture of treasure hunters. And on account of that relation, I, in turn, became a major celebrity among these treasure hunters. And so sort of the other thread of the book is sort of me interacting with these treasure hunters, trying to figure out what it is, trying to figure out the legacy of this man named Menachem Kaiser, who in a really interesting and unexpected way becomes a kind of like alternate grandfather. He's like, because I never actually get closer to my real grandfather, but I sort of stumble upon this extraordinarily rich and compelling legacy, including with like actual literal treasure hunters of this other Menachem Kaiser. And so that is my long-winded intro into, I would say, that would be my pitch, to a very patient person of, why to read the book.
Menachem, first I want to tell everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the chat as we go along. But the part about the fortune hunters is extremely interesting. Mm-hmm. And also the profile of the kind of people they are. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about this tunnel and, why people don't know about it, or it wasn't really publicized. And then how did these people come to get involved with that?
Sure. So let me sort of like dissect the question. And so on one hand, let me tell you about the treasure hunter subculture. It's not a fringe subculture. It's in fact like quite a large and vibrant one. And so the numbers are, I would say, probably over 100,000 of people who like identify as part of this community. It's a big number and includes a lot of different kinds of groups. And so on one hand, on one side of the spectrum, you have like amateurs, who are going out with the metal detectors and they're sort of like searching for things. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have extremely sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment like LiDAR or radar or drones. And so I'm using the word treasure hunters because that's what they use. It's a little bit of a misnomer. I would say they're looking for objects, and some of them actually do find really interesting objects. But past that, they're interested in things of what they call mystery, which are unexplained, buildings or infrastructure or battlefields or sites. And some of them do what actual legitimate historical research. So one of them, who absolutely identifies as a quote unquote treasure hunter, he had spent 5 years tracking down a concentration camp that had effectively disappeared, like a concentration camp that is just like was not on the map. And there's actually quite a few of these. And so he had like talked to locals, he had looked at maps, and he had found in the field like where the barracks had been. And it was an incredible moment. He led me into the field, and there was like this line of cemented bricks where like the barracks of this concentration camp that is like it's just not listed. And you have other ones who are like into some really zany conspiracy theories, which we'll get to in a second. And okay, the tunnels. And so the tunnels, it's the proper term for it is Project Riza. And I'm using the word tunnels, but that really undersells it. The tunnels are 7 underground complexes that were built sort of surrounding a mountain. None of them were completed, but the ones closest to completion are huge. Like, let me not use metric. We're talking like square miles in area. We're talking like ceilings that could be 60 feet tall, or rooms that are 300 feet long, with like grids and levels, just gigantic. They're basically subterranean neighborhoods. I usually can't do this because I don't. There's but am I able to share screen, Madeline?
Yes, give me 1 sec to make you a co-host, and then you'll be able to.
So I could actually show you guys. This is a tree. I don't usually get to do this, but to show you pictures of some of the tunnels. And so here we go. And so are people able to see that? I guess there's not.
Oh, wow.
So this is actually what the smallest one is. The first one I went to. This is actually a photo from the first time I went in them. This is the tiniest one, not open to the public. You basically have to know the GPS coordinates for it. And so this is like an actual tunnel put into the side of the mountain. So they're very sort of staggering to behold, because these are like Nazi tunnels put in the side of the mountain, just a huge infrastructure project. What makes them like really enigmatic and really challenging is that there's basically no primary documentation as to what the Nazis had planned to do with the tunnels. And so a sort of real sense of mystery and like a real culture of mystery has surrounded these for 40 years. And so for the treasure hunters, these tunnels, these underground complexes have become basically like they're everything. They've all spent time in them. They have like a real sacred feel to them. It's like they all explore it. They're all obsessed with it. And so let me show you. Okay, that's another one from the smaller one. This is one of the larger ones, which is open to the public, and this is like partially reinforced with concrete, so you got to start to get a sense of like what it might have felt like. Here you can see sort of how their construction methods. They would put 2 tunnels one on top of the other, then collapse the sort of the ceiling between them in order to make a giant tunnel. This one, it's like hard to get sense of scale, but that ceiling is like 60 feet tall, and just like gigantic rooms. This again, from like where the photographer is standing to the back of that back wall, I think is 300 feet. They're just like really enormous things. And then to like loop it all together to say like how I got involved. So basically, because these tunnels have no primary documentation, here's the story. There was a slave laborer named Abraham Kaiser. He was working in the various camps that supplied the labor to working on these tunnels. He kept a secret diary. He kept the story of the diary is like as amazing as sort of the contents of the diary. And so he would steal scraps of cement packaging and then, write these memoirs down. And then right before he'd be transferred from camp to camp, he'd hide the memoirs by nailing them to the underside of the latrine. And after the war, he survived. He sort of met a German woman who hid him for a month. Then he survived. Then he borrowed a bicycle from this woman and rode from camp to camp, collecting these scraps of cement packaging, brought them to a Polish editor. And in the early 60s, this book was published. It's called Za Drzwiami Śmierci, which means Behind the Wires of Death. And it is a Holocaust diary, for lack of a better term, which recounts his day-to-day experience in these camps, which, it's an amazing document in its own right. But when you sort of put it in the context of the treasure hunters, it takes on a whole different dimension, because for the treasure hunters, this diary is the primary document. Like, it is what they study. And so I would subsequently come to meet treasure hunters who've read it more than 40 times, or who have sort of followed Abraham's pilgrimage from camp to camp. They all know about him. They're all obsessed with him. Like, I had the very strange experience over the last few years of signing his memoir. Like, the treasure hunters would ask me, because they saw me as his only relative, of signing a Holocaust memoir not written by me. It's a very strange experience, but they were really doing it out of a sense of respect that was a little off-putting, but overall, I guess, okay. But anyways, so that is another long-winded answer into how the tunnels sort of feature within this community.
Menachem, where do you, what you also talked about, that you discovered these relatives through him, or Abraham was related to your grandfather, is that correct?
So Abraham was it's interesting, the way I found out, I went to these tunnels for I didn't know I had any sort of special connection with these treasure hunters or with these tunnels. I went because I was like writing a novel at the time, and I had read about something called the Golden Train, which, for all those who are curious, you should look up the 2015 Golden Train story. It's a really wild story. But basically, these two treasure hunters claimed that they found this golden train, which has been like a legend for 40 years, like full of 44 crates of looted Nazi gold inside these tunnels, these mountains. I never heard of anything like this before. At that point, I'd spent like 7 years in the region doing research. I never heard of like tunnels or Nazi gold or anything. At the time I was writing a novel that was partially set in Poland. I was like, this sounds like a fun thing to put in the novel, like this golden train thing. And so I just emailed a woman who was like sort of like the local authority, and asked her if she would take me around for 2 days. And she said yes. And then she took me to the tunnels, and it was really wild and really crazy, really challenging, really interesting. And then at one of the sites, I bought this memoir. Okay, well, it's actually even a longer story, but we'll speed it up. Basically, I bought this memoir by Abraham Kaiser in Polish. I didn't think we were related. I just bought it as like a souvenir. And that night I went through it, and there was a preface written in Polish, which I don't speak, and I took a photo of it with my phone. I scanned the text with my phone and put it through Google Translate, and I saw it had a lot of biographical information. And using the documents that my lawyer had gotten from the property reclamation, I was able to construct a family tree, really for the first time ever. I was able to construct a family tree and saw that Abraham and my grandfather were not only related, but were in fact first cousins, which made it the closest surviving relatives. None of my grandfather's siblings or parents or aunts and uncles survived. So it was really just Abraham. It turned out also his sister had gotten out before the war, and his brother escaped to Argentina. And so I had a whole new branch of the family to meet.
So have you connected with any of Abraham's descendants? I mean, other than you?
So Abraham had a son and a wife who were murdered in Auschwitz. And then after the war, he eventually moved to Israel, got remarried, but never had kids. but he did have he had a sister in Israel, and she had two daughters, one of whom became a very, very famous Israeli children's book author and poet. I actually have one of her poems in the book, and they had kids. So I met all of them. And then there's another branch of the family that went to Argentina, and I've met that branch of the family as well. But the actual sort of most special, I would say, family connection I met was I actually tracked down the children of the German woman who had saved him.
Ah,
And so I actually went to Germany and I met these kids who were alive and they remembered Abraham. And they actually, the story started opening up in a really incredible way, because they told me, not only was Abraham saved by this woman whose name was Gertrude, they in fact became lovers. And they had a relationship, and Abraham stayed with her for a year to 2 years after the war. And they had like this really heartbreaking story of, it was really amazing, because I came to visit these two daughters and a son who were in their 80s and 90s, and I showed them Abraham's photo, and they talked to the photo as a father figure. They referred to Abraham as Papi, and they told me that their mother kept a photo of him on her wall for the rest of her life, and so she
well,
never
that's
got
a
remarried.
novel. Menachem, that's the beginning of a novel.
Oh, it's like that to me. That story is like the most like special, I would say,
Mhm.
nugget that I uncovered in all the years of writing this book. And so it was really incredible. Like she had a husband, her husband was drafted into the German army and was killed in Italy one day before the war ended.
Mhm.
But for whatever reason, the family never got the death notice until 1993 or something, like 40 years or 50 years, like a crazy number. And so basically this woman Gertrude, and at the time of her husband's death, she was hiding this Jewish soldier who would later go on to become her lover. And so there's like a deep, like really poignant irony there. And the story of Gertrude was like one of the really special things I was able to sort of uncover. And so she was nominated. It's like a wild story, a wild coincidence, but she eventually was nominated and accepted as a Righteous Among the Gentiles by Yad Vashem in 1999, like 6 weeks before she died. So yeah, it's a real special little story there.
So you said that you started out to write a novel. So how did you come to decide that this was going to be a nonfiction book and not something that you created? And I have one more question. These tunnels, they kind of remind me of the tunnels you saw in the movie where they store all the art that was looted from Europe. Do you think there was any connection with that? Maybe that they were supposed to be used for that?
So I haven't seen the movie. I've read a little bit about that. From what I understand, those were salt mines, I think.
Oh,
I
and it was
think those were
Monument Men.
I think those were sort of
yeah.
they sort of utilized mines or salt mines or caves. These were gigantic infrastructure projects. We don't know exactly what they were meant to be used for. We have a pretty good idea. It was probably a factory of some sort, ultimately, or some kind of like headquarters that would be on the eastern. This province before the war was Germany, and so it was like close enough to Berlin that it was accessible, but far enough that it wasn't getting bombed. And so people suspect that it would be like an Eastern Front headquarters for Nazi brass. But because there's no good, reliable historical information, there's a ton of conspiracy theories, which get really bizarre, very, very bizarre, including like things like anti-gravity, that the Germans were sort of developing like super secret weapons, including anti-gravity or time travel or a moon base or nuclear weapons or like long range lasers. And these conspiracy theories are pretty funny, but also pretty pernicious and way more endemic and widespread than I initially understood. And so the most research intensive chapter in the book by far is the one where I sort of tackle the conspiracy theories, where I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand them and what sort of the underlying implications might be. And so that's what you asked a question first. There was a first part to that question. I
So the
forgot,
first
right?
part, I said you mentioned you were going to write a novel, but then
Oh.
you ended up writing a nonfiction book.
So yeah, it's a little backwards in a way, because when I began the property reclamation, I was actually pretty adamant that I wasn't going to write about the property reclamation because it felt really interesting to me, but it felt really familiar. I didn't feel like I had like a new story to tell. I felt like I had a personal and meaningful way for me to sort of get in touch with my grandfather and my own legacy. But I was like, what's the book? I didn't really see a book. But then, I started with the Treasure Hunters thinking I would write a novel, but then I found out I was related to this Abraham Kaiser guy. And then, to be honest, the story got too weird to write as fiction. It just got too strange. And so you're like, I didn't really receive it as good news. I was actually kind of bummed. I was like, ugh, now I have to try and write this book. Like I can't just you don't let an opportunity like that go. And so I took a year and I wrote a book proposal, which to try and sell this book. And it went. People were interested. It got sold, and then I wrote the rest of it. But pretty quickly, as soon as it got became really bizarre and personal, I didn't see it. I didn't see an interesting way to write fiction about it. And also the thing with fiction is, there's an old saying, it's annoying because fiction has to make sense. So it's a real shortfall of fiction that it has to make some sort of narrative sense. The nice thing about writing this as nonfiction is that, I'm pretty transparent that I'm trying to piece this together. I'm trying to figure out what is what, where the meaning lies, how to go about it. I'm honest about my mistakes. I'm honest about the errors. I'm honest, I am honest when I don't know what something means. And so this story actually doesn't lend itself well to fiction because it's not neat. It's a very, very messy story. And for me, it was very important to have that messiness in there because that's the only way it would feel honest.
So have you been able to get the building back in your family?
No, it's still ongoing. Again, I don't think that constitutes a spoiler, but maybe it does. But also, I don't care. The spoilers are fine. I'm a big believer that spoilers are okay.
So really, I'd like to open this up to our participants. You can either write something in the chat or unmute yourself, raise your hand, and ask Menachem any questions that you might have about the story. Do we have any questions or comments? Richard, why don't you unmute yourself?
My question is there a movie in the works?
So the answer is, and so I've been working with a film producer, not actually about my story because
it's a great story. It should be.
It is a good story. To me, it's a good story and it exists. And so we had some inquiries about making a documentary about it. And I was like, what would you do? Just put the camera on me and I would talk about it. I didn't see what a film version of my story would be, unless it was adapting it into a fiction, which you could start playing with it. That's really interesting to me, but no one's approached me about that. But the documentary about me particularly wasn't that interesting. And we ended up sort of having these very long discussions, and we ended up pivoting to a documentary about the Golden Train, which is one of the wildest stories that's never been fully told. And so that is in the works, though it's going slowly because this just how these things go.
Okay, yes, Roseanne?
Okay, I tried, when we went to, my grandfather was from Berlin. And I actually found, my siblings and I each found 3 different locations that we think were the locations of his store.
Yeah.
And we were actually just really happy to find the location of his store. And I found that my father and his brother were born and lived upstairs from my grandfather, from the store. But the building was definitely bombed out. And so I don't think that, a lot of people, it's interesting, but there's not this building that's left anymore, especially in areas like Berlin.
Right.
I didn't go to Poland outside of Krakow to see my grandmother's family home, but it was interesting because I couldn't even get to the location with the help of the Germans. They were like, it's like asking, I describe it as it's asking where the bathrooms are in Italy. All of a sudden, nobody speaks English. So I
Yeah.
kind of admire that you got as far as you did, because all of a sudden, here I was in Berlin with these I had my father's birth certificate. I had my grandfather's business card. I had documents, and everybody was like, we don't speak English, from the synagogues to,
Yeah.
and so I really admire you. And I'm wondering, like, I'd go back, but like the building that I found was in the middle of a street now. So like there's nothing to
Yeah.
reclaim.
It's
So I don't know that people have that much to reclaim other than memories. I mean, I know where that part of the family wound up, and they're all over the country. It's my grandmother's family that, were spent the time in the camps, and I'd be interested in following them, but I think they pretty much all were murdered. So I don't know. I admired your story. I'm glad you found relatives. I've tracked down relatives, and they've said, like, you can't be my relative, and I'm like, yeah, I am. So I don't know.
yeah. I agree on all counts.
So,
Jane,
any next time I go back, any hints?
Yeah, you need a fixer. You need a local fixer, and they exist. And like that, the amount of help I got is really extraordinary. And it's to be, I don't love it, but in the book, it's largely invisible. The fact, like, for every step I made, I was relying on the help of locals and Polish people.
I mean, I tried the guys who do the tourism.
Yeah, you don't want the
synagogues.
pros. You don't want the professional. You don't want the professionals. You want the sort of like in all these countries, in Germany, in Poland, there's a number of really devoted people to Jewish history and Jewish stories, usually non-Jews, and there are people. I'm way less familiar with Germany than I am with Poland, but
I have a Poland part of the family too. So,
yeah,
but we didn't even try that after the Germany incident. So, but you need a fixer. Is there a way? I mean, I know people have found fixers.
It depends, like, what city usually, or what your objective is, or what you're trying to do. But there's usually people out there who either like do it semi-professionally or sort of just locals, and it's just, or you figure out what you need to figure out, and then you just pay someone to like knock on the door for you, or just, it's just really helpful to I did that basically every step of the way, for the treasure hunters, with the property, with my lawyers, with everything.
Yeah, I didn't have that much time. I mean, I was in Berlin for 5 days. I was in Poland for 4 days.
It does take a lot of time.
It does take a
it
while.
sounds like, Menachem, you were there a number of years.
I didn't live there. I never lived in Poland, but basically for a bulk of this, I was in graduate school, so I was able to go summers. And so from like 2011 to like 2018, I would say I was probably there like 2 to 3 months a year. And so the first year, the property reclamation only began in 2015, and the book writing only really began in earnest in 2017. And so, but I spent a lot of time there, and so I had like a really good network. It's a very easy place to make friends, and so people just were really helpful.
I didn't find that in Berlin.
Yeah.
Jane, you made some comments in the chat. Do you want to just speak to that? You have to come off mute, Jane. You're on mute.
Not just listening to your story, Menachem, but to all the stories that we've heard so far. There's a certain amount of just dogged research that goes along with these stories. And what you find is not what you set out to find. And you bump into other stories along the way. And it's a lot
Yeah.
of it is
Oh,
it's kismet.
for-
It's just
Oh, for sure. I like if people sometimes ask me a question, which I find kind of a weird question. They're like, "What's your, what's your takeaway?" And I'm like, "Okay," but I, to the extent I have one, is absolutely like, if you push on a story, something weird will happen. Especially like these legacy stories and happening in these different countries. Like people ask me like, should they do this? Like, and I'm like, look, reclaiming a property probably won't work, and like you probably don't have the time for it. But chasing down a story,
Mhm.
even if it's research or travel, I guarantee it's not what you expect. And if it's a very familiar story, I guarantee there's something in there that's wrong. Like you have your story incorrect on some level. And so, and I can't even tell you how many times, because like over the years I've been in Poland, and a lot of people come and I help them out. People come with this sort of like this fixture. They're like, I'm going to go to this city and meet this thing, and their whole story, like that they grew up with, is incorrect.
Right.
Like a major detail or a minor detail. I know at least half a dozen people who went to the wrong town.
Mhm.
Like, and that's it's really like it's a lot more apparent than people realize. And so I definitely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, things happen.
There was another question that I had, and that is regarding your grandfather. He survived the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
And then he married, and your father was born, but he didn't talk. Your grandfather didn't talk.
Right.
And so there's this silence that has to be conquered. I mean, did you
Yeah.
talk to your father about
Yeah,
what?
it's an interesting thing, because like I think it's hard for me to relate to today. And like my father's been a really good corrective in that sense, because my father, he's like, look, because when I think of a survivor, I have an image, I have a real image, and that is not the image in 1952. When my grandparents moved they actually lived in Germany after the war, and then they moved to New York, and so they were younger. They're about the age I am now, actually. You're pretty interesting to think about. And so I'm in my mid-30s, and so like they were singularly focused. Well, what am I saying? They were born in 1920. They were younger than I am now. They were in their early 30s. And so like they were singularly focused on rebuilding their life. And so like it wasn't necessarily a traumatized response, although we absolutely would sort of use that language today to describe it. But it was one of those, like, they didn't have money, they were building a community more or less from scratch. They were starting families. And also the thing that like father always says, he's like, it wasn't like, for where he grew up, which was a community of survivors, first in Washington Heights and then in Toronto in Canada. He was like, it was not predominant, it was ubiquitous. It was everyone. Like the most startling thing my father says about this, he's like, I did not know about the concept of grandparents. He's like, no one I knew had grandparents. Like I never met anyone with grandparents until I was out of the house. And so like it was just like the norm. And like I think some people talked about it because sort of discerning my grandparents' trauma from afar is really hard. And like I don't pretend to be able to do it. I will say though, later on in life, like well after my grandfather died, and like my grandmother in the late 90s, my sister just put a camera on her and asked about it, and like she talked, and like no one had ever asked her. And so she started like telling her story for the first time ever. And it's like funny, like how much we didn't know and how much we thought we know. Like I have a sort of a stark example in the book, is that on my grandmother's tombstone, we have the wrong birth city.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we just have the wrong birth city, and like it's like one of these weird things that's just like no one pieced it together in time. And so but yeah, the silence thing is like, it's interesting. I didn't experience it as silence. I just, because I never sort of questioned it. I didn't think there was like knowledge to be had. I just thought it was just sort of like a blank history. But yeah.
Well, I think the issue of statistics, birth dates that was not so unusual because, you know, my
Not
mother.
birthday, birth city.
Oh,
Birthplace, the wrong
okay.
birthplace. Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. I'm sure we have tons of mistakes about dates. This is like she said it was born in Oshvenchim, and she was not born in Oshvenchim. You know, she was born in Rzeszów, which is across the country. So yeah, the mistakes to me are really interesting.
So
And
how did they get up to Canada? What was the reason they're moving?
they moved to Washington Heights in the early 50s. My father was born in Washington Heights. And then in the early 60s, you know, a few people just made the move really they were going to start to do business up there. Really just, they felt they had a business opportunity up in Toronto, and like a core group, like some like second cousins of mine, they were all like living together in one apartment, like, you know, and so they just sort of moved together to Toronto, Canada. There is like a family story, which I think it's true, but I'm not sure it's true, that they were actually supposed to move to Australia. And but the person they sent with all the money disappeared with all the money. But like, you know, I grew up with that story, and like now I'm a little bit more suspicious of it. And so maybe I don't know.
So do we have any other questions, comments that people would like to make? So I want to thank you, Menachem, and I want to remind people they can purchase your book in their favorite bookseller. Where we down here, it's the Regulator bookstore in Durham, and then Flyleaf bookstore in Jane. Do you think they both have them in
Chapel Hill? Yeah,
in Chapel Hill, or you know, wherever you buy books? And
I will say just last week the paperback came out. So if you don't like the design of the hardcover, or if you think hardcovers are too big or unwieldy, then get the paperback.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Menachem, so much.
My
We
pleasure.
really
Thank you so much
appreciate
for the
it.
invitation.
And I want to just remind people that tomorrow we have 2 more authors coming. I don't know the one in Jane. Do you know the?
Yes, we're having Rafi Berg, who's speaking to us from Israel about his book, Red Sea Spies, and then Morningside Heights, which you're.
Oh, wait, Josh.
Henke.
Josh Henke, yeah.
The nicest guy in the world. Yeah, so tell him I said that, and hopefully he'll be a little bit sheepish and embarrassed, but he is like the absolute nicest and like super talented. So that's a real treat.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.